So we are live now, and this is our, I should say, to be very frank, first live session for day two for Internationalism Earth Forum. We have Professor Dattesh and we have Vijay Lakshmi as my co-moderator. So, this is Abhivardhan, and Vijay Lakshmi and I will be discussing a very impeccable topic today, which is Indian foreign policy and its connection with Indian culture. So the gist of the topic is that we are discussing about India's culture and its avenues as to how the international legal part and the diplomatic part has been invented and inspired by the Indian culture. So, in the last day, we had discussed with Dr. Nanda Kishore about India's cultural moralism. We connected with India's constitutional values somewhere down the line. So, today we are going at the global level. We are talking about how diplomatically India's culture is actually a very relevant factor. We will compare it with the recent 1945 to 2010 Cold War, Cold War and globalization trends. And we'll definitely have a very wondrous discussion moving ahead. So, Vijay Lakshmi, please take this forward.
Yeah, thank you, Abhi. Good noon, everyone. I, Vijaya Lakshmi Raju, Associate Editor of Legit by Internationalism with Abhivardhan, welcome you all to our today's session. We have Assistant Professor Mr. Dattesh D. Prabhu Parulekar from Department of International Relations, School of International Area and Studies, SIAS, from Goa University with us as our honorable speaker for this session. We are enlightened having this great personality among us on the discussion for India's cultural roots to international law and diplomacy. Welcome you, sir.
Thank you. So would you want me to begin?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. At the outset, I'm indeed delighted to be at this forum, and I thank Internationalism for inviting me to share my views. Now, let me just make some initial points in which I will flag certain issues which could then become potential themes for discussion. Let's begin with something that I find very curious that's happening as the pandemic is playing out. In the month of May, when the pandemic was hitting Europe very hard, and there was a lot of talk of the need for an earnest vaccine, and people were getting going on it, the two major countries in the world who are right now locked in a kind of a standoff in what people call as the new Cold War, namely the US and China, both were put into a difficult corner. President Trump and President Xi both felt the compelling need to come out and publicly reassure the world that in the event they find a vaccine and nobody else has it, that these two countries will not corner this vaccine and use it as an instrument of state policy, but would actually make it part of what is called as the global public good. Now, you would ask yourself, these two countries obviously are rich countries, big economies, etc. But India also has its own pedigree when it comes to vaccines, when it comes to making generic drugs. Why did the need arise for the leaders of these two countries to have to publicly disabuse any notion that they would misuse or abuse their positions of power with regard to this vaccine? But no such questions were asked of India or the Indian Prime Minister, nor did India feel the need to say anything. I think this is a very fundamental point because it goes to the heart of what determines sovereign state disposition in the world that we are in. Sovereign state disposition is not only about the capacity that you have, the pedigreed wherewithal that you have. In fact, along with the pedigreed wherewithal, which you may or may not have in various degrees, it is also the credence, it is the reputation, it is the turpitude of the state, which of course doesn't get built overnight. It gets built over decades of experience. It gets built over decades and over centuries of how you have essentially customized your way of behavior. And in the case of India, because India is a civilization, it goes back to ancient Indian civilization. Now, why there is a need to look at India's cultural civilizational roots and to try and extrapolate from that how India disposes or how India behaves in the world is because while you've had many civilizations in the world, those civilizations have tended to be largely conformist in nature. And that's why, in terms of their actually playing out, they have tended to be more of corporatized in terms of how they have come about. With regard to the Indian civilization, which of course everyone understands, the Bharatiya civilization, where we have a certain edifying ethos that has evolved over time, the uniqueness of this is not only is this civilization time tested and time honored, but actually it's timeless. And when something is timeless, it works in two ways. It's open to intermingling with various other strands. It's also open to being enriched. But at the same time, it is able to draw on a certain fundamental, common, recurring thread that keeps it alive, that keeps it dynamic, that keeps it resilient. And that's why what we need to really understand in terms of both India's contribution to international law, the firmament of international law, and the welter of international relations is the fact that what India brings to the table is ideas that are both nirantar and chirantar, which is abidingly continuing but also eternal. And that is why, regardless of India's power quotient, regardless of how strong or not so strong India may be in terms of influencing global opinion on the sheer strength of comprehensive national power, it is the moral power that India brings to the table. The very fact that India's democracy is seen as a very impeccable democracy, the very fact that India is a nation of 1.4 billion people that in every which way accepts diversity and also exudes pluralism, when this gets reflected on the global stage, it then plays itself out in terms of various ways of understanding India, whether it's in terms of the Indian way that Dr. Jaishankar has put forward, or what I may say is what I had also indicated some days back on one of my posts, is terming India as the new power of the Southwest, where India brings to the table the aspirations of the global South. And that's why the widespread of developing countries and what they would like to see in terms of changes in the international order, both in the legal order and also in the political order, but also the ability to be able to absorb modernism. I think today, when we look around the world, we are seeing a lot of tensions around the whole idea of identity. But India doesn't have that problem of identity. India is not waging a battle over identity. India really is trying to tell the world that whatever identities may be there, what is important is to understand the civilizational continuum that we are part of. We often look at the international cultural space as West and East. So you have the Occident and you have the Oriental. But the point is, even within this West and East dichotomy, I would not go into broad brush strokes and say all Eastern civilizational experiences are very similar. And here I would like to bring in two quick flagging points between, let's say, the Chinese understanding of how their civilization plays out and the Indian understanding of how its civilization plays out. For instance, if you see the Chinese philosophical understanding and construct of Tianxia, which is the Chinese strategic worldview, it's really a worldview that likes to build Chinese centricity. So it looks to build a core and it has tributaries around it. That's how Chinese actions, both in terms of its current actions, but also in harking back to its civilizational antecedents, plays itself out, because that seems to have become the conditioning moral compass. In contrast, India's context is more of creating a benign continuum neighborhood. And that's why when the world talks of geopolitical and geoeconomic neighborhoods, it's India and the current government, which over the last 6 years introduced geo-civilizational compact as being a core element of India's foreign policy and India's global engagements. And you see that, for example, in two ways. You see that both in the legal space, you also see it in the civilizational and the geopolitical space. We all know that India's cultural footprints have extended across Southeast Asia, not just in mainland Southeast Asia that we were aware of, but even as far removed as, say, the Philippines and even East Timor, where we are now finding relics and remnants of Indian voyages that have gone there. But just because India has a large, expansive footprint culturally and civilizationally to its east and its west, does India go around making historical claims? We don't go around making these historical claims. But if you look at China, for instance, it uses its connections, its antecedents, its interaction of the past, however tenuous it may be, to try and draw certain historical claims which really have very, very little to basis in international law. Secondly, respect for international law. I think respect for international law also comes if you have a very strong moral quotient. India, of course, is the most powerful country in South Asia. And yet, when Bangladesh took India to the International Court of Justice on delimiting the boundary, delimitation in the maritime boundary, of course, the judgment went against us. Now, normally you would exercise that when countries interact, they do so on the basis of hegemonic power differential. Quite clearly, India has a lot more stakes and a lot more power than Bangladesh does. But India chose to respect the ruling that came from the International Court of Justice, even though there were political reasons also, but the major point was a respect for international law. Now, you characterize this with what happened with the Permanent Court of Arbitration and the ruling that they gave in favor of Philippines versus China with regard to the maritime claims in the South China Sea. And China has just brushed it away. So it's no longer West versus East. Even within the East, there are various kinds of Eastern experiences, and we have to look at some of them. I'll also drop one of the more important elements, and I'll stop then and we can have a conversation. It's really about the whole idea of how do we actually see the whole idea of Vasudev Kutumbakam. Because this is something that has really become the core, in a sense, lingua, which describes India's civilizational interface and interaction today. And that is because India, when it looks at the world, we often say the whole universe is one family. We don't even say the world is one family, because even a world then leaves out certain cosmic elements that don't get interacted with this world. So we say the whole universe is one family. And why family? Because again, family has a very strong connotation as compared to communities, as compared to societies, and even worse, as compared to tribes. Because in the Western culture, for a long time, the feeling was that you either look at morality through the prism of religion, and that's why much of the Western legal concept has really been an enumeration of the Christian thought, and the Christian thought as essentially being superior, and that's why the Christian thought is essentially sought to be imposed on all others as being the gospel thought. And then you have the obvious pushback, which leads to things like clash of civilizations. Now, as against this, when you talk of a family, you are effectively going beyond communities, societies, identities, and basically uniting everybody else. And if the world needs solidarity, if the world needs stability, and if the world needs sustainability, the three S's that are most important, both from a legal standpoint and a political standpoint, what you need is really this sense of being one family together. And that's why you take the simple example. When India was part of the Paris Accords, and of course the then UN Secretary General Gutierrez, when he met with Prime Minister Modi in 2018 in Buenos Aires on the sidelines of the G20, he appreciated Prime Minister Modi for his leadership leading to the Paris Accords. And Prime Minister Modi very politely but with conviction told him, what we have done is not only in our enlightened self-interest, but it's also our commitment to our culture and our civilization. Because although we have erred over the years, we do recognize that cultural civilizational compact with nature is very essential for us. But we haven't stopped at that. In 2017, we took forward the sentiment of a sustainable and an environmentally conscious and green world to create the International Solar Alliance. We didn't go around creating institutions or creating initiatives that would essentially inundate countries with debt. We chose the idea of sustainable renewable energy as being very important for the developing community, and more than 120 countries today are signatories of the International Solar Alliance. And as we speak in May of this year, we have now taken that to the next level, where India has embarked, along with the global community, on what is largely being called as an alternative to the Chinese Belt and Road, but one that is rooted in a certain sustainable, deliberated, and a democratic exercise of consensus, which is to create the one sun, the one world, the one grid concept, which is essentially to create an interconnected set of grids of renewable energy over the next 15 years across the tropics and across the south and the north, whereby countries can actually move from their current natural behavior to a more refined kind of behavior. So I think I'll stop at that, and I'll be happy to engage in the discussion that I think we are going to have now. So thank you very much.
Certainly grateful to know that, sir. I'm quite curious to discuss some avenues regarding the transformation of Indian diplomacy, especially under the current External Affairs Minister, because as you pointed out about the Solar Initiative and India's leadership quanta. So there have been certain interesting incidents, and critics and scholars of international relations, while they criticize the non-aligned movement, which is of another significance or non-significance, they now focus on this problem that while a theoretical, that's just a question, a theoretical understanding is being propelled among the public that if the Indo-China tussle is happening in the border, which is I think now lessening due to de-escalation as far as it is reported by the ANI. The very issue that the very proposition that people make is India should be one of the first countries to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is one thing which I would ask whether it is a reasonable step, because as you have pointed out about the Judeo-Christian tradition in the international legal history, as far as the Western powers and the global North has obviously taken it, we often call it as a white man savior complex. We often call it ethnocentrism in this century. All the movies and started from Bill Clinton to Obama to Trump also. So first question is whether India should join NATO or India should be a part of these alliances, because Minister Jaishankar has already stated in a very interesting summit, I think India summit, that India is not interested in multilateral alliances. Instead, it is interested and wishes the US also to be accustomed with multipolarity. So this is one, and the second part is, do we think that India's multi-alignment strategy when it comes to human resources, and because domestic issues also are a very important part, they can actually take a more transformational take considering South Asia? So these two questions for you. You can take your time. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll get to the first point first. I mean, obviously, let's understand one thing. We are today in a world where functional coordination and functional cooperation is actually given much premium. So institutional forms that have existed during the Cold War or even since are now actually losing a lot of their sheen. In fact, NATO itself is really now more in peer operations, and even NATO seems to have got largely marginalized because of the transatlantic tensions that have crept up. And there are huge differences between Europe and the United States on various issues from Russia to China, etc. So in that sense, obviously, NATO is off the table. But since you talked about NATO, let's talk about the kind of grouping that has been underway and probably is now given a lot more importance. And a lot of the literature calls it the Asian NATO, which is the Quad Security Quadrilateral Dialogue. Now, the point is, the Quad is a very interesting alliance. And this is something which doesn't carry the formal rubrics of alliances as we understood them to be. At the same time, if it can reach its ultimate goal and achieve a certain degree of optimal operation, it can actually be a very important front to preserve principles of the global order and principles with regard to managing the global commons. So what Dr. Jaishankar and the Modi government has been saying is very clear, that we are not part of the old order. This is a new India and this is a new 21st century world. This is a world where non-alignment has yielded to multi-alignment. But as we today call it, we've even gone further in calling it pluri-alignment, where you actually, for example, look at the Middle East. I mean, you talked about you talked about South Asia, but look at the Middle East. If at all, over the last 5 or 6 years, India has managed to somehow work out its relationship with both Israel, Iran, and also Saudi Arabia in a manner in which all three can actually operate simultaneously without stresses and tensions actually affecting either of them, and yet being able to pursue mutually beneficial relations with all of them. So the days of formal alliances are over, and India has never subscribed to formal alliances because we have always valued the idea of strategic autonomy. Now, I know there are many who would be amused and say, look, what is strategic autonomy? It's something that India has often loved to talk about, get very sentimental about, but is there really strategic autonomy? Now, I think there is. Because for anyone who would laugh it off and say there is nothing called a strategic autonomy, I think India even now continues to show that it can work in a mutually beneficial manner and a productive manner with almost all global powers without losing its sense of symmetry or equilibrium. And we saw that in the case of the S-400. Because if we were just rolling over and were willing to allow the US to co-opt us, then we would not have gone in for the S-400. I think the very fact that we stood our ground and said we will stick with the S-400, our relationship with Russia is important. Apart from that, it's a very good platform and a very good system in terms of its technical configurations. And even though we run the risk, and I say it here for a reason, because it has been, said back channel that if India pursues the relationship, particularly the S-400 lands up in town, then probably India will be saying goodbye to the highest degree of defense and strategic cooperation of a technological nature and a sensitive nature with the US. But even though this situation remains, we still continue to pursue our relations with these powers. Now, coming to South Asia, there's no doubt that we have to work on the human transformation angle, as you rightly said. And that's why, if you see what Prime Minister Modi did in the very beginning, he gave a very important slogan in the context of South Asia. In fact, when he was talking at the first summit, which he, of course, had the informal summit, where the leaders were here for his swearing in 2014, he talked about highways to highways. And what he essentially saying was moving beyond physical infrastructure, which of course has its importance in terms of connecting you physically, to moving to various different aspects of connectivity, which can bring a lot of benefits to society. And the highways was very important because he was talking about information highways, and that doesn't mean just information technology. It means the whole gamut of what brings societies that intellect. It can also be intellectual highway. The eye can also be intellectual. So it can actually work wonders in terms of being able to bring human transformation. India has to lead it because ultimately we're not going to be able to match the Chinese stroke for stroke when it comes to infrastructure building of a physical nature. I mean, we need to get real about it. It's not about trying to copy them or trying to basically run off them, because it's a race you will not win. But where India brings a very unique approach to international affairs is this whole idea where we don't look at transactionalism, but we look at mutually beneficial intertwining. And that intertwining is happening with a lot of countries. It's definitely happening with Bangladesh. It's, of course, been happening with Sri Lanka. We hope it will go ahead with the Maldives. But we don't look at South Asia the way normally South Asia is understood, which is a geopolitical South Asia. We actually expand and say that for us, it is really a continuum on both sides of India. And that's why you see that despite of not having a clear land border with Afghanistan, which of course was not our immediate neighbor, we have been the second largest developmental partner to Afghanistan behind the United States. That's the kind of money that India has put in for the benefit and the betterment of Afghanistan, because it also is in our own benefit. And similarly, we have also been able to work with Bangladesh on many, many initiatives. We've been working with Bhutan in terms of trying to improve many of the aspects in the human transformation. So there is a lot of linkages between the domestic and the international that are more apparent today. And that's why domestic policy making is no longer removed from international engagements. Domestic policy making is looked upon as a sense of credibility for your international engagements.
Thank you, sir. It was really great. And I just have a follow-up question. Would you please let us know what is the progress towards the strategic autonomy?
Look, the whole idea of strategic autonomy may sound very abstract, because if you say, look, define to me what strategic autonomy is, there is a definition, but that definition is contextual. So, for example, when you say strategic autonomy, this is something that India has sworn by for decades across governments. For example, let's look at our nuclear program. In 1969, when the NPT was enacted, and it basically was, in many ways, this is the problems with international law, that while international law is capstone in terms of its symbolic content, it really loses out in terms of its rectitude, its probity. And India took a principled stand that we will not sign the NPT because, in our understanding, it created a world of nuclear haves and nuclear have-nots, which is unacceptable to India. And we spoke for the entire world, the world that was left outside of the five powers. We have stood our ground all these years, and this has been seen as a wonderful example of India's strategic autonomy, that even in 1974 and in 1998, when we conducted our two nuclear tests, we came under sanctions. After 74, we came under sanctions, huge sanctions. After 98, we came under sanctions as well. But across governments, we were able to hold on to that position, that our ability to determine our civil nuclear program and our nuclear deterrent is intrinsically ours, and we will not allow any pressures to come to bear. At the same time, out of our sense of responsibility to a nuclear weapons free world, and I would like to point this out because strategic autonomy is not only in terms of defending yourself or defending your interests, it's also being able to confidently articulate your vision of the world. And look what India did, not just with Rajiv Gandhi's disarmament plan that he put forward in 1980s, but Prime Minister Vajpayee after the 1998 nuclear tests. At the next time that he was at the UN General Assembly, he actually used the bully pulpit of the UN General Assembly to formally declare a moratorium on further nuclear testing. Nobody had compelled India, nobody had bound India to announce that. But Prime Minister Vajpayee announced it. And he even declared that India was willing to enter into negotiations on a fissile material cut-off treaty, which many countries were running, steering clear of because they didn't want to really commit themselves to the table in terms of putting fissile material cut-offs on their own stockpiles. We were willing to do that. But we said we will not accept any curbs on our nuclear program. We will decide the destiny of our nuclear program. We even committed ourselves to a minimum nuclear deterrent, which of course we haven't spelled out because nobody spells it out. But what gave the world confidence was two things, and this is where I come to this whole aspect of strategic autonomy. Even though India did not sign the NPT, did we use that fact that we were outside the NPT to undermine the NPT regime? Not once. In fact, while many countries in the world who will stay out of NPT may look to undermine the NPT and leverage their own status, we've seen what Pakistan has done, we've seen what North Korea has done, even after being within the NPT and walking out of it in and out. India stayed out of it, but in a sense voluntarily assumed all the obligations that were duty bound and cast upon an NPT member signatory, even though we were not a signatory. And that's why 35 years down the line, when the whole issue of the Hyde Agreement and the 123 Civil Nuclear Agreement with the United States came up, you had America's President George W. Bush, when he was informed these things, he actually lauded the fact that India may not have signed the NPT, but by 35 years of the way in which it has behaved, it has shown itself to be a responsible stakeholder. And that's why we come across and we are able to also make these arguments by defending our strategic autonomy. So I would say this is one of the best examples where strategic autonomy is a combination of rights, it's also a combination of responsibilities. So India, in a sense, knows how to articulate what is rightfully its, at the same time knows how to assume responsible obligations as a responsible member of the international community.
It was really interesting to know, sir.
Yeah, really interesting take. So I have a little bit query in case of understanding the historicity of South Asia, or I should say Asia as a whole, adding up Middle East, Eurasia, and South Asian region as a whole. So while we know that the Middle East is becoming multipolar, which is true, because now it's no more influenced completely by the Pax Americana. It's not just the typical Shia-Sunni conflict which is being taught and which is being professed all the time. It's now changing, like Saudi Arabia-Russian relations, or I should say, for that matter, Iran-China relations. So when we know that historically the Sino-Indo relations have always been like this, they have never been so idealistic, they've never been always so calm, because more or less Sino-Indian diplomacy is cultural, and while we know that China's policy is very realist and hardcore realist, India's India's own rejuvenating policy structure, which is new, I should say, which is often what we call as moralist and reasonable, because that's what is something we have been discussing so far, that it makes India's foreign policy and international law commitment way better. How do you see what we can learn from the historical commitments of the Sino-Indian diplomacy, during the Maharajas or during the Sultanate and so? What do you think, sir?
Look, I mean, see what happens at the end of the day when you look at the Sino-Indian diplomatic, kind of traditions. You see basically two very distinct ordering systems, and that is what I think is really comes about. And what do I mean by that? Because while we have obviously believed that, look, India and China are two civilizational neighbors. We are large neighbors, and we look at essentially ourselves not only as territorial units or as politically imposed systems, but we look upon ourselves, and for that matter, even the larger, wider world, as essentially demographies which have their own aspirations, are dynamic, and they also articulate these from time to time. However, the fact remains that there are two very fundamental ways in which the East, and when I say East, it's largely the Asian East, has really been shaped. And I said that in my opening remarks as well. On the one hand, you have the Indian experience, which is rooted really in its civilizational past of how the various kings have dealt with situations. For example, dharma. I mean, the whole idea of dharma continues to be a very, very important element of our understanding of ourselves and the world. And again, when you say dharma, it has almost nothing to do with religion in this context, because there is no religious kind of spread or manifestation that we are trying to do. What exactly is being done is essentially talked about the righteousness of actions in the international space. And that's why India's whole purpose, right through civilization, through its 7 decades, I mean, through various governments, each government has prioritized what it understood to be the righteousness of actions. So when we were independent, we obviously had important priorities of democratization. We had issues of decolonization. We obviously wanted to stay out of power blocks and wanted a third way, a middle path, so to speak. We were obviously concerned about the new international economic order and what it was doing to the North-South relations. So we were seen as a kind of spokesman for the global South and the wide swath of developing and underdeveloped countries who were called third world countries at that time. But there was always this element of solidarity, which has always, persisted. That's why when we talk of Akhanda Bharat, this whole concept of Akhanda Bharat, it must not be seen as a predatory kind of a slogan. In much the way, in much the same way as the Chinese would talk about creating the old Chinese empire, or the Russians would go about saying we would like to bring back the former Soviet Union. It's not in that sense. It's really an appreciation of the bonds and the affinities of cultures that we have had. For example, look at diaspora. I think India is one of the most unique countries with such a large global diaspora of almost 40 million. And I say that because since you talk to the Middle East, a lot of our people live in the Middle East. But look at how we basically are able to fine tune our relations, where we obviously care for these people who live there, because they're obviously Indian citizens who work in that part of the world. Many of them have settled there. At the same time, we don't allow ourselves to cross the limits. So, for example, just look, for example, what happened in Malaysia for many years. You've had the Tamilians who've been pressing with the Indian government, saying, look, you should be stepping in, you should be talking to the Malaysian government as to how they treat us. We are your own people. You should see us in terms of your own people. While we see them as our own people in civilizational terms, but we also see our relationship with Malaysia in also civilizational terms. And that's why there is no crossing the boundaries of good neighborly conduct, which obviously requires us not to interfere in the sovereign affairs of other countries. Now you compare this with the other side, which is essentially, as I said, trying to create a world order, not only today, but through history, through the last 7-8 decades, which is essentially of Sinocentrism. That's why you talk of a Pax Sinica today, which is really the Chinese influence that is now becoming global in many senses. Where is the talk of a Pax Indica? There's no talk of Pax Indica. Although if you actually went around surveying the influence and the kind of role that India has had around the world, you may be able to actually weave a kind of a Pax Indica. But you don't see that in clear, stark terms, because India doesn't necessarily believe in entrenching that kind of influence. The influence comes more by your conduct and how people appraise and appreciate your conduct, and not in terms of actually trying to create a centrist world. Now, talking about South Asia and the historical makeup of South Asia, you've had these problems because obviously you have redrawn borders. And whenever you have redrawn borders and redrawn boundaries, you're going to have problems. Look at what happens in Africa. Africa bears the brunt today because many of the problems in Africa are not created necessarily by Africans. They were essentially holdovers from the colonial times, and they continue to fester because Africa has lacked the strength of institutions. The same can be said about South Asia. That while South Asia has got tremendous resources in terms of its human resource and in terms of, it also has tremendous amount of weaknesses, and one of them is these historical baggages that exist. That's why when we talk of South Asia, most of the time we continue to be still swept by the British understanding of South Asia, and that is what they gave us. But that is where our foreign policy has begun to be unique. For example, if you see when Prime Minister Modi was inaugurated in 2014 for the first time, he didn't just invite only the SAARC leaders. Everyone got carried away by the invitation only to the SAARC leaders. But there was an invitation also for Myanmar, and there was an invitation also for Mauritius. So what does it say? That when it comes to South Asia, we have to go beyond just the historical byproduct of colonized times of South Asia and look at our own region anew. And that is why we see our region not only in terms of geographical features, we see our region in terms of its changing, ethnicity. We see it in terms of its changing economic fundamentals, and that's why there is no geographically delimited South Asia, but there is actually a very, I would say fluid South Asia in some senses, but fluid in a more positive sense, where you are actually able to interact with areas much beyond the traditional notions of South Asia. And that's why when we look at South Asia, or when the government today looks at South Asia, tries to formalize policies for South Asia, there is no one South Asia. There is a disaggregated many South Asias. You have a continental South Asia, within which again you have a Himalayan South Asia. You have a maritime South Asia, which doesn't just mean Maldives and Sri Lanka, but also brings in our Indian Ocean countries like Mauritius and Seychelles. You also have a peninsular South Asia, which is today's BIMSTEC. I mean, if you see the BIMSTEC community, it's basically peninsular South Asia, a large connection with peninsular South Asia. So there are these different South Asias that exist, and they are in constant interaction, which is now challenging the old historical stereotype notion that we have been brought up and we have been steeped to understand through the British traditions.
Thank you so much, sir. I think we really discussed some very impeccable points. So now we may conclude the session very shortly. But one last question, and I think we can conclude it briefly. Uh, so
Sure.
when we say the notion of a superpower, and we have also discussed that, you know, more or less the discussion of the talk today has been on the avenues of how India, as a soft power and as a hard power, has been balancing itself and creating its, virtues. That's what we have been discussing on, either through the altars of dharma or through understanding geopolitically how it interacts, whether it is pro alliance or pro partnership. So, although it's a very abstract question, but can we expect India to be, a relevant superpower? Although it is, I consider it as a diplomatic power, as a strategic partner to the Americans. But apart from that, can India maintain its significance as a new kind of superpower, or may it will be aligning with the West in some other forms, or maybe the usual forms like Japan and South Korea? So, what's your take on that, sir?
Okay, I think that's a fascinating question probably to end with, because it's also ideation and also operational. When we look at superpower, and again we have these notions given to us obviously in terms of how superpowers have acted. Superpowers have been known to be superpowers because they exercise hegemony. And we've been one country that has always necessarily said that hegemony is not something that sits easy with us. Because at the end of the day, hegemony essentially is going to involve pressurization, imposition, and that is going to face pushbacks. So when we talk of the kind of superpower that we want to be, we don't call it a superpower. Our cultural civilization notion tells us that we want to once again recapture the status of a Vishwaguru. And this Vishwaguru, I think, is something that we, as young strategic and commentators and those who are young, must be able to now take up this discourse and run with it. That why do we necessarily have to see ourselves only as slotting ourselves into this whole topic of superpower? Why can't we call ourselves as the Vishwaguru, which has a lot of connotation about being a mentor, about being driven by values, about being a bridge power? I mean, I remember Professor Raja Mohan had, in the early part of the 21st century, he coined this phrase of the swing power. He said India is a swing power, and what he was essentially saying was that India would essentially determine which side the pendulum oscillates. Now, that's fine. We've continued to be that, and we continue to be that today as well in some regards. Just take a look at this. There are two very important trilaterals that exist within Asia, which actually, in a sense, maintain the balance of power. One is what is called as the JAI, which is Japan, America, India. And the other one is, of course, now it's under severe stress because of the India-China relationship, but is the RIC, which is the Russia, India, China trilateral. Now, which is the common factor in both? It's only the I that is a common factor in both. It tells you that naturally what India brings to the table is the ability to actually be a rich power. But do you only want to be a conduit? Do you only want to be bridging? Or do you also want to be bonding? Do you want to be part of bonding? And if that has to happen, you have to bring to the table not only the known elements of hard power, which of course, without that, you can't do anything. You can't build soft power without having a plinth of hard power. No country in the world has become a global power only on the basis of its soft power. Its soft power must have the hard power. So there's no escaping that. But what India can do with its hard power as it continues to build it both militarily and economically is to bring the whole idea of India to intermediate on various issues that are today creating tensions. For example, when yoga was mooted at the UN General Assembly by Prime Minister Modi in 2014, and when the resolution came up for voting in 2015, 177 countries of the world voted in favor, effusively in favor of instituting an International Day of Yoga. And you must remember that the first block of countries who came together in support of India were not India's neighbors, were not the countries who we understand are part of either the Hindu tradition or the Buddhist tradition, but countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, this is important because these countries are actually Roman Catholic countries. And you would normally think that because the Vatican had said that we don't support yoga, we see yoga through the prism of Hinduism, and therefore it's a promotion of Hindu identity. That's not the way Latin American countries saw it, because Latin American countries don't see yoga through the prism of religion. They are adherents of yoga. Yoga is extremely popular there. They don't even see it as that. They see it as a form of holistic well-being that provides wellness at a time when healthcare and your vitality as a human being is being tested by the pandemic. You could have the most hard power, but can you face the pandemic? What will help you face the pandemic is your ability to keep yourself healthy. And that's why India's ability to bring through the Ministry of Ayush a whole lot of products through yoga, through other therapeutic medicines, just to calm people down, to bring a calming influence on the world. I think this can do more than what a superpower with a huge army and a huge economy may not be able to do. Look at Russia, for it may not be a great economic power any longer. It continues to be a major military power. But what is Russia is seen as a disruptor. So you always think of Russian actions as looking to destabilize different sectors of the world order. Do you see India destabilizing any sector of the world order or looking to destabilize? Not at all. Which is why when the US and China were waging a battle over who controls the WHO and how the WHO has become a stooge, I mean, today the Chinese are being blamed, but the UN institutions have been used as a handmaiden by the United States for donkey's years. So let's not blame only China. Every major power in the world has misused international institutions. At that time, India comes forward and says, because India, of course, through Dr. Harshvardhan, has now become the chairman of the executive board. But why did India get the kind of effusive support from the WHO plenary? It's because what India brings to the table in terms of healthcare, India's ability, as I said in the very beginning, to be able to not use healthcare as an instrument of state policy, but as a provisioning of public good. But more importantly, India's message that it's not about a Chinese WHO or an American WHO. It is about restoring back the credibility and sanctity of the World Health Organization, which is necessary for all of us. So it is the message that India brings to the table, which over time is going to build India into this credible Vishwaguru, which I think will do much more than any other understanding of a superpower as we have known it to be, again in the Western concept.
Thank you so much, sir. I believe this was a really impeccable discussion. I think we really discussed some very important points, and understanding Indian diplomacy and its commitments to international law and multilateralism through culture is somewhere down the line, I believe, would be a complex phenomena, But I think India and its Indian culture and its complex history makes us democratically very much wide and open, that we accept to love and live in complexity, and we improve ourselves, we try to improve the world. And I think that would also improve and transform the notion of Vishnu Guru. I'm really thankful that we had this talk, and we are ending this live session anyways. But thank you so much for the session, sir. It's really been wonderful,
Thank you
and
for
really,
hosting
really
me.
grateful. Yeah.
Pleasure was also mine. Thank you for hosting me. So thank you to Abhivardhan and Vijay Lakshmi and the whole team at Internationalism. Thank you very much.